Hi out there, everyone. This recording is part of the Historical Society of the New York Courts, recording of the bar's response to the pandemic project. Now, the purpose of this project is the Historical Society is attempting to record and archive the way in which the private bar in New York State has responded to the pandemic, in terms of how its practices have changed, how court procedures have changed, and just generally how lawyers have dealt with these changing circumstances as they've arisen. I'm Alex Drylewski. I'm a litigation attorney at Skadden Arps in New York City, and I'm a member of the Young Lawyers Committee of the New York Historical Society. I'm going to be interviewing my good friend and colleague, Scott Musoff, today. He is a litigation partner and the head of the litigation group at Skadden Arps here in New York City. So Scott, thank you for joining.
Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it, Alex.
I think the most important question to ask up front, is the beard a typical beard or is this a quarantine beard?
Definitely a quarantine beard. I was not a beard or mustache person, but I decided to give it a try during the quarantine. I'm not sure how long I'm going to keep it, but for the time being, it's serving its purpose.
Excellent. As someone who can't grow a beard that long, I'm equal parts envious and I guess a bit relieved that I can't get to that point. But it's something to be commended.
It just allows you to just go like this, and then you immediately appear to have wisdom, so it comes in handy.
I see that. Yeah, no, that works. So why don't we start, if you could, up front, just give a little bit of background on your position and your role at Skadden.
Sure. Well, I started at Skadden as a summer associate in 1993 and then clerked for Judge Jacob Bishler in the Eastern District of New York, and then came back full-time to Skadden in the fall of 1995 in the litigation department in New York, and began to develop an expertise in securities litigation, other types of corporate and commercial litigation. And I'm now currently the head of the New York litigation practice, what we now call the Complex Litigation and Trials Group, as well as the deputy co-head of our nationwide securities litigation practice.
And why don't we talk a little bit about your personal experiences since the pandemic has hit in New York? If you could tell us a little bit up front about just how you and your family have been impacted by COVID-19.
Sure. So I have three daughters. One just graduated college, 21. Another one just finished freshman year in college. She's 18, and one who is about to turn 16, 10th grader. So, it was interesting because in March, my oldest daughter's school ended first. She was at Tufts University, and her senior year got cut short on a few days' notice before we were even out of the office here in New York City, and it hit hard. It was very disruptive. The end of senior year, potentially no graduation, but we quickly realized as a family how fortunate we were and how difficult so many other people had it and how disruptive this really became to so many lives. So always kept things in perspective from that perspective. And to be honest with you, I feel fortunate in so many ways because we used the time to have some what I call bonus family time that we might not have had otherwise. So trying to make the most of it. So from that perspective, it's obviously, like everybody, there's been some disruptions, but unable to see parents and in-laws and that type of thing. But luckily, I had a few close friends who came down with the coronavirus. Some more seriously than others, but luckily, nobody too serious that I knew well.
Yeah, you're up. You're not in New York City. You're up in Westchester County. Is that right?
That's right. I'm in Edgemont, a small town right outside of Scarsdale, and I haven't been back to New York City since I think March 16th. That was before the Second Circuit on their last day of oral arguments. We had just moved into our new offices for about 4.5 days, and then that's it. I haven't been back since.
So you were in the new office for 4.5 days and haven't been back since.
That's right. We moved from 4 Times Square to 1 Manhattan West, which is next to Hudson Yards, in an incredible logistical feat, moving 800 or so attorneys, another 1,000 support staff or so. And we had just completed that when the offices got closed.
And did you know that you weren't going to go back to the office and take some stuff with you before you went? Or was it all of a sudden one day you realized, hey, I'm home and I'm not going to be back in for a while?
It was more the latter. I was not really prepared for it. And I have to say, early on, I was probably in the camp that I did not think this was going to last as long or be as severe. And if I remember correctly, that Friday we did a test remote day, and so nobody really came to the office. That was supposed to be, and then we never came back. So that's how I recall it.
Is there anything that's currently sitting in your office that you just wish you had with you up at your house in Westchester?
Honestly, nothing in particular, but I do wish. I'm still a little bit old school with sometimes working and marking up briefs and complaints and otherwise on paper. So I had gotten a lot, we'll probably talk about this more, but I really had to get used to doing a lot more reading and drafting and editing on the screen directly without printing, which may be in the long run better for the environment, but it took a lot of getting used to. So amongst other things I miss about being in the office, but that in the office itself was having access to, I still had, the CPLR book and a lot of other papers I had for cases that I really like to touch and feel.
Yeah. So before this all happened, did you already have, a fully set up home office with everything you needed, or were adjustments made to account for all of these changed circumstances?
It's a great question. I was fortunate enough to have a home office that was pretty well equipped, but I definitely, after a few weeks of being home and realizing we were probably going to be here for longer than I thought, did a couple of upgrades. Upgraded the printer, upgraded my monitor, got a landline telephone that works just like our office phones. It plugs into the internet. So definitely upgraded a bit. But I was fortunate enough to have a home office that I used for evenings and weekends before this.
Yeah, I can say from my experience, my home office now has become just like my Skadden office in terms of the technology. There's very little of a gap between the two now, thankfully, given the technology. But is there one major difference that you noticed between your home office and the office, at 4 Times Square or 1 Manhattan West?
In 1 Manhattan West, my wife didn't yell at me for having piles of paper all over the floor. So that's one difference. So I'm trying to be a little bit neater in my home office than I ever was. But that's how I think sometimes with throwing papers around and making piles. So I joke about it, but it has, caused me to rethink how I organize myself with the various piles around my desk and on the floor and things like that. I do miss even though I have a home office that works well, there was definitely a little more room to spread out on the desk itself, not necessarily the office itself, but on the desk and the monitor and things like that.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I miss about not being in the physical office are the daily interactions with people, just walking in and out of people's offices, chatting, running for coffee, talking about things. How have you dealt with the lack of that now?
So that to me, I couldn't agree with you more, Alex. That to me is what I miss the most between people on your team, people that you would bounce ideas off, even if they weren't on your team, working with support staff, secretaries, legal assistants, all the attorneys. I miss that a lot. And we've tried to use technology to make up for some of that. We use WebEx mostly at Skadden, similar to Zoom and other things, and we use it quite frequently, team meetings, and then we also have social events that we try and do by video to try and keep people connected. But it is a challenge and takes a little more effort. You have to be a little more intentional and deliberate about it. And I am concerned over time, you lose a little bit of the brainstorming, the things that I think sometimes separated us in ways where we came up with ideas that organically grew out of some of those interactions. Walking down the hall and knocking on somebody's door and walking in and just bouncing ideas off and getting ideas and hearing about what's going on. And we try and meet regularly as a department on WebEx at least once a week. We then break down into small groups, usually once a week to meet, and then the various teams get together in various sizes as well. So we're trying to recreate that, but it's not as easy, especially interacting with people in different departments as well. We have a Thursday all-attorney lunch where you just go down and you can sit anywhere with anybody from all different groups and just eat lunch together. And that was a great way to see people both socially and professionally.
Yeah. Have you found that there are certain, associates or certain members of the firm that have taken to this new virtual law firm model better than others? Have you noticed that some of the younger associates maybe are more comfortable meeting by WebEx than some of the older attorneys? Or is this just a brave new world for everybody?
It's interesting because I think one thing that's somewhat ironic is I think some of the younger attorneys who were sort of probably in the camp of wanting to have more remote work even before the pandemic and wanted to work at home more, I think may miss some of that interaction. We were just talking about it more than others. And I can't wait to get back into the office. So it's a little bit of both. I think in the beginning, there was definitely an advantage to some of the younger people with technology, the use of Zoom and WebEx and FaceTime and all of that. But I think we've all pretty much caught up, it seems. Most people seem very comfortable with it. And it's really, what's so amazing is since so many of our clients are not in New York, so many of the lawyers we deal with are not in New York, we used to do a lot of that by phone. And now, because everybody's so good at using video, because of that, I think we've in some ways had better interactions with people that were outside of New York than we did beforehand, and internationally.
Yeah. On your point about the brainstorming and the ability to just interact with people in small settings, I remember as a junior associate having an idea and thinking, this could be a good idea, this could be a really dumb idea, and maybe not wanting to put it in writing, but walking into an office like your office and saying, hey, what do you think about this? Have you thought about how do we encourage people to continue to want to come up with those ideas that maybe they're unsure about and don't really want to put in writing, but we still want to get the creative juices flowing as a group?
Yeah, I think a couple of ways. I think one is having some scheduled calls and videos with your team, even when you don't have a specific agenda item, because that'll allow some of that free flow. And then, of course, to encourage the spontaneous call or video as you think of things. That's where I think sometimes we lose a little bit being so far apart, where you think of something and say, oh, you know what, I'll raise this on the next call. And then you either forget or it morphs in your mind a little bit. Some of what you were just talking about, some of that instantaneous discussion and feedback, even if you're not reluctant to put it in writing, by verbally discussing it, you get feedback, and together you come up with sometimes an even better idea. So that's something we're trying to preserve.
Now, shifting from the internal at the law firm to the external with the courts, can you just talk a little bit about how COVID-19 has affected your practice vis-a-vis the court system in New York?
Sure. So in the beginning, when the governor issued the stay of filings and extended some statutes of limitations, there was a dramatic drop-off in court appearances and filings, in how long is this going to last, extending discovery deadlines. But not that long after that, as the people realized, one, we're not coming back immediately, we're going to have to figure out how to litigate in this new world. things started to move forward again. And obviously the courts began to open up virtually, both for filings as well as appearances. And so that now we're back to a rhythm, I think, again. Again, not exactly the same, but a pretty solid, steady drumbeat of keeping busy with the courts themselves. I've had several oral arguments, and conferences, some telephonic, some by video, in the commercial division of Supreme New York County, and it's worked remarkably well. I certainly miss being in the courthouse. I miss being in person, looking a judge in the eyes and reading expressions, looking at your adversary, having colleagues right next to you, passing notes, having a chance to have a discovery conference in the hallway and bounce ideas off people and come back in with sometimes a whole new schedule, sometimes sometimes not. That you don't really have remotely.
Yeah. And now you mentioned that you've had several arguments. Have you noticed that the practices of the justices in the commercial division have been pretty similar in terms of holding virtual conferences or virtual oral arguments, or have they differed somewhat?
I think in terms of whether they're going to have argument or not, I think that seem to be the same. I think that's one thing. But in fact, in the first department, we had a stay matter, and we got on the phone within a couple of days with Justice Mazzarelli and had a full-blown argument telephonically. I think with all arguments that are done telephonically or by video, you just have to be very careful not to step on your adversary or the judge, the justice, or interrupt them when they're speaking. So you end up holding back a little bit, and I think it's a little less spontaneous at times than it was when you're in person. And I hope it's not resulting in less questions from the bench, but that was a concern of mine, that it just becomes a little harder to interrupt and interject. But so far, I haven't. So it's hardest, I think, on the court reporters, to tell you the truth.
Yeah. I was going to say, if anything, I think we're trained as litigators to try not to speak over one another in court because of the court reporters. And I wonder if that's helped in some way to deal with the current situation and the limitations on the technology.
Yeah, I think so. I do. I think good oral advocacy always had that element of, pausing at the right time but it's harder on the phone to read when a question's about to come. There's something instinctual when you're in the room together that you could feel a question coming, or a comment, and it gives you a chance to pause and allow that to seamlessly work into the argument.
And what for you has been the biggest challenge of practicing this way and doing everything remotely? Is it that lack of in-person human contact that informs the way in which you present yourself in your arguments?
I think so. I think that's been the biggest challenge externally, vis-a-vis the courts. I think is getting, trying to get that good feel for what's going on. And I haven't, but colleagues of mine have done some virtual trials and virtual depositions, which, are, works better than people think. But again, it's not the same as being in the courtroom. I think the hardest part, though, of all of this is what we were talking about, was just the lack of personal interaction, either amongst colleagues, amongst you and your adversary, amongst co-counsel. So much sometimes gets done in these casual one-off meetings in the hallways of the courtroom, getting ready to prepare for an argument, sitting around the conference table with colleagues, those brainstorming sessions we were talking about. Mm-hmm. It's hard when you're arguing and the note gets passed to you through an email or through our some version of a chat program. And when is it, the level of importance to require a note and things like that. It's all a little bit different, but managing, quite well, I think, compared to other industries. I think lawyers were set up pretty well for remote access. So I think it's working okay.
Right. And then you mentioned virtual depositions or remote depositions. Can you just walk through a little bit logistically how you can even do that and manage having a witness you're either questioning or defending, and presumably, since we do commercial litigation, a lot of documents to show?
So yeah, it's great. There are two primary ways, and that's not exclusive. There are lots of ways to do it. But one camp is sending the documents in a box to the witness in advance, with the understanding amongst counsel that you're not going to open the box till the deposition starts if you're taking the deposition. And then the witness has hard copy, and the box is also sent to your adversary, and everybody pulls out exhibits that they're asked to look at. There's obviously some, downside to that, and there may be exhibits you never use that are going to still be in the box and things like that. But that's one way to do it. But with technology these days and iPads and computers and PDFs, you could also bookmark and send documents either in advance or as you need them, and screen share them or send them to them if you can work out two devices. And that's probably given us a head start to what was going to be a trend towards that in any event. So that's been working better than I think some people would have thought.
That's interesting. So you mentioned that it was trending in that direction even before COVID-19. Do you see that becoming the general practice going forward, even if we recover and the pandemic is resolved?
Not completely, but we'll see more and more of it, and it'll happen more quickly. That yes, you'll start being at depositions or in court where the exhibits are electronic rather than hard copy. Rather than having 3 witness binders for a witness in the courtroom, you may just put up the documents on the screen, or have a separate iPad for them to flip through the documents. I think people are getting much more comfortable with that. And again, for the environment, it's probably a good thing.
Yeah. I know there are a number of current justices in the commercial division who have been pushing for more use of technology like that in their courtrooms. And so if there's a silver lining here at all, it may be that it's sped up the learning curve for a lot of the lawyers in this community to start really employing that technology that's available.
Agreed. Great point.
Now you mentioned one thing when it comes to depositions, sending a box ahead of time with the understanding that the opposing counsel won't rummage through it and start coming up with strategies. In a lot of ways, I think lawyers have to take each other at their word and have to work together through the difficulties of this crisis, whether it's adjournments, extensions of filing, things like sending documents in advance. Have you found that to be the case? And generally, have you had issues along those lines, or have you found that attorneys have been working together and working in an honest and trustworthy way to get through this?
I would say that this has proven once again why we are a profession and not a business. The professional courtesies extended to each other, the trust. Our entire litigation system works on the honor code. Mm-hmm. Discovery, turning over your client's documents, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and doing so based on the attorney's representations that it was done. So I've always felt that way. That there's no other profession that I could think of where so much rests on the honor and the integrity of the adversarial counsel. But I think it's been proven that way immensely during this pandemic, reminding me of the time period, at least in New York, post 9/11, where people needed lots of professional courtesies and understanding and otherwise. And I think the bar has proven itself, at least in New York, to uphold those standards.
Yeah, I was going to ask, and you preempted the question, which is whether this current situation reminds you of any other situation you've dealt with in your professional career. You mentioned 9/11. Can you talk a little bit about the similarities, and if there are any other time periods where there were similar situations or characteristics that you had to deal with?
Yeah, in some ways, this is completely unique. I mean, this is really what I sometimes say is day to day, everything seems to be going fine. But when you really step back and realize that you haven't been in the office in months, and we may not go back for months, and how shut down the economy was, and how many people were hurt, both financially, health-wise, and otherwise, I think this really has been unique. But there are elements of it that are similar to other periods. So being out of the office post 9/11 on a moment's notice, not being able to travel as easily post 9/11. So you figured out other ways to stay in touch with clients and lawyers that were outside of New York. So that's a similarity. I think the other similarities have been, through some boom and bust times. I think that when I started in the early 90s, we heard over and over again, oh, you missed the 80s. It'll never be that exciting again from a M&A perspective, a corporate litigation perspective. And then, after the loan crisis in 91 and things started to improve again, things took off. And then eventually the dot-com bubble and things were on top of the world. And then the dot-com bubble burst and people said, oh, that's the end of it. We'll never have any growth like that again. And then things grew and grew and improved through 2006, 7 into 2008. And then we had the worst financial crisis we've had since the Great Depression. And that was long and deep, and it took a long time to come out of. So we've gone through boom and bust cycles again. So from an economic perspective, understanding that we're, in a downturn, you just have to have the resiliency to get through it. And I think those that have been around longer understand that and have that resiliency. And we're all wishing for more of a V-like recovery from this than perhaps other financial crises.
Well, what do you see as the recovery here? Do you think there's indications of a V-like recovery? Is there a light at the end of the tunnel here in your view?
I'm an eternal optimist, so I always think there's a light at the end of the tunnel. I do think, though, that as well as this remote access, remote working has been, we're somewhat working on the fumes of our personal relationships. So it's very easy to have this type of interaction with you because I've known you for a long time. We're close friends. We're close colleagues. It's much easier. If you were somebody I haven't met before ever, it may not be as easy to do that. The justices I've appeared before, both telephonically and virtually, I've been before numerous times. So I feel like I had an advantage there where a younger attorney or somebody who has not been before these justices may not have had, the same comfort level of being in front of them remotely, whether by video or by telephone. Mm-hmm. So, and one of the, we pride ourselves at Skadden as we're only as good as the people. We have a whole new class coming in. We have a summer class that just started. We have new associates coming in the fall. And I think that is going to be the challenge. How do you keep the firm culture? How do you train people? How do you integrate people if we're still remotely? But I do think things are starting to open up, and if we continue to do things safely and securely, we'll start easing back into things at some point.
Yeah. Is there any particular lesson that you've learned through this that you would tell new lawyers about or tell others that may face crises like this in the future?
I think, it's easier if you're not starting from scratch. So in other words, you got to rely on the skill set that you've already developed as a lawyer. So the things we're talking about, coming up with ideas and brainstorming, you got to still continue to do that and figure out ways to adapt and express your ideas and get them across. Same thing with an oral argument. If your idea is not working, you're live and you need to shift, because you feel from the judge, you could do that virtually or otherwise. So I think what I would take away from it is that it requires you, as I think, as any good litigator, to be able to be a little bit more flexible, to be able to pivot, to be able to think on your feet, and to adapt to the situation. And it may require a little more effort. I think there are some other things you have to work on when you're working and living in the same space. You have to learn to draw some boundaries. I think that's something as lawyers we've had difficulty doing, even when you're not working at home, with the long hours and certainly not being a 9-to-5 job. So I think you have to be extra careful when you're doing it at home. And then keeping up the client relationships, being super responsive to clients is important. I think the other thing that we'll take out of this is being able to be a little more flexible, perhaps, with people that have child care issues, people that need to work perhaps on more flexible hours. I think this has proven that it's more doable than some people have thought before.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one thing I think that's very hard for some people, those that have young kids at home or taking care of elderly adults. It's not as easy to necessarily be as on as you were before. But I think there's ways we figured out to accommodate those concerns. And I think we need to carry those forward.
Yeah, and we mentioned, or you mentioned, attorneys. We talked about judges in the courts. What about clients? Generally, how has the reaction of clients been to all of this? And have there been any difficult discussions where the clients want to do something that just we can't do in the current situation, or have they all been generally understanding of the realities of what's going on right now?
Well, I think we found ways to do whatever needs to get done. So we haven't had to say no, and very proud that we've been able to do that. I do think, especially in the beginning, we did help some clients through some major crises, some in the hospitality and leisure industries, some in the real estate areas, some in various industries that got hit particularly hard. And that's what you want to be. You want to be a trusted advisor for those clients that come to you with their toughest, hardest problems. So I think proving that you're there in this situation helps solidify that bond, and being there for them whenever needed helps with that. And it did require a lot of effort and work on all of our parts to do that and to be responsive. But I think that's helped solidify some relationship. Even if it would have been a situation where you would have hopped on a plane and been there the next day, you found other ways to be there, both electronically and just providing, extremely important work product for them.
So Scott, I guess lastly, what do you see as either aspects of technology or otherwise aspects of practicing in New York State that you think will carry forward even beyond the pandemic?
Well, a couple of things. For example, we've had several successful mediations that we've done virtually by video.
Mm-hmm.
And those used to be very expensive on clients to send people, fly people in sometimes from all over the country, sometimes all over the world, to meet with a mediator all in person. And I think that is something that may carry over even past the pandemic, and will save a lot of travel time and travel costs. I certainly wouldn't want to forego, being in the courtroom and being live, but I do think there are some conferences that can be done, and some judges were already moving in this direction, doing things telephonically or virtually rather than having to bring everybody down to the courthouse. Again, I wouldn't want to replace live arguments and a chance to appear before the various justices, but I do think people are getting more comfortable with using technology to do that. And I also think perhaps visiting clients as well, that you can do some of it by video rather than having to always hop on a plane. I don't think, though, that will replace in-person meetings. I think people want to look people eye to eye, and that will eventually come back. But I think we are going to see a lot of that come back, as well as I mentioned earlier, the remote access for those that need more flexibility due to childcare or other reasons. I think we can accommodate that a lot more easily now that we've done this.
Great. So that's all of our time. I want to say thanks very much for taking the time to talk about this and to share your experiences. The folks at the Historical Society all agree this is important to be documenting and archiving just how different aspects of the New York State legal profession have dealt with this unprecedented crisis. And your answers have been really enlightening. So thank you very much for your time. And for all of those that are watching this, since you're watching it, you're probably already on the website, but it's history.newyorkcourts.gov. We are archiving and collecting videos like this one, photos of courts and their reopening procedures and other things to document what's going on out there. We hope you find it useful and interesting. So thanks for listening, and Scott, thanks again for taking the time.
Thank you, Alex. Thanks to the Historical Society.